Hi, students. Today we're going to be looking at the glory that was Greece. And this is going to be a great lesson that's going to basically show you what are the big things that Greece accomplished during its golden age. What are the things that we remember Greece in this elevated glory kind of a way for? Now, one thing I got to say before we even really get into it is that uh, when we're talking about the glory that was Greece here, almost all of these things actually happen in Athens. Because remember, this is the golden age of Greece. And during the golden age, the city state that pretty much controls things is Athens with its Delian League. Anyway, let's get to it. The objectives for today is we're going to be analyzing the political and ethical ideas developed by the philosophers, Greek philosophers. Philosophy is this, we'll get into it, but it's a huge idea that the Greeks really bring that we still have huge implications of today. Then we're going to look at architecture and art. So philosophy is one big thing. The next one is art, architecture, and then also writing and plays, things like that, that are all part of the art world. And then finally, we're going to look at one of my personal favorites, the way that Greeks change the way that history is recorded and written about. So those are going to be the big things we're going to learn about today. There are some vocab words. You're going to want to make sure that these all get into your notes. You can see there is also some names that are going to be very critically important today. Some of the famous philosophers and also some of the famous uh, different types of things the Greeks come up with during this golden age. All right, so our focus question, make sure you write it down and make sure you get an answer to it at the end of class. So don't forget when the notes are done, you go back and get this answer. How did Greek thinkers, artists, and writers explore the nature of the universe and people's place in it? So, they have confidence in the human mind. The idea that the Athenians, they put so much value on your brain power. Where the Spartans talked about muscles and fighting, the Greeks were all about the brain. And that really guides them through the golden age and allows them to create a lot of glory that was Greece. And that's what we're going to talk about here. First of all, number one, most important thing the Greeks come up with is this idea of philosophy. Now, kind of a big word. What is philosophy? Philosophy is really the idea, the concept of the love of learning. Really, the word philosophy really means lovers of wisdom. So the philosophers in Athens, understandably, because they love the idea of learning and using your brain so much, they get this idea that not everything is necessarily controlled by the gods and whatever crazy thing the gods want to do. Instead, the Greeks would say, the philosophers would say that you can use your brain, you can use reason, you can use logic to discover what happens in the world. You can use logic to discover things about the planets and the seasons. You can use logic to discover why things happen. And this is really a concept that still has a lot of meaning today. If you think about the general perspective of the world, it's that people are smart enough and strong enough to really figure out anything. And this concept was really started with the Greek philosophers. A few of the important Greek philosophers, one of the concepts in philosophy that started at this time, of course, studying logic, studying math, really studying science, really studying anything. That's what philosophers love to do. But there was this one branch of philosophers called the sophists. And the sophists, they started to believe that, you know what, right and wrong doesn't matter so much. What really matters is success. So if you have to do some shady things in order to get success, logic tells me the shady things are okay because I was successful. Not everybody liked this, but this is starting to be a really popular idea, especially among the leaders in Athens at the time. Well, there was one very famous philosopher that kind of challenged that, and his name was Socrates. And Socrates was really critical of the sophists. He was definitely a philosopher and definitely believed in the power of the brain, but he also believed in certain moral teachings that you should think about. Socrates' favorite way to teach is he really wouldn't come out with his own ideas. What he would do is he would ask questions. In fact, we even call this the Socratic method today. And some classes and teachers teach still using Socrates' method that was developed thousands of years ago. It basically is what Socrates would do. Imagine this. If you'd come up to Socrates and want to learn from this famous philosopher in ancient Greece, you'd say, Socrates, tell me about the meaning of life. And Socrates would say, what do you think the meaning of life is? He'd ask you a question. You'd give an answer, what you think the meaning of life is, and then he'd say, why did you say that? And it was almost to the annoying part, but he would teach by asking questions and challenging your ideas on important concepts that people had in Athens. And there were some people, especially the sophists, that really didn't like that. But Socrates had quite a following. He was an older man as well. His most famous student is named Plato, and we will talk about him next. Interesting thing about Socrates, though, people really started to get upset with some of the things that he was spreading around Athens, especially with the youth. And so the leaders of Athens, remember, this is a democracy at the time, they bring Socrates into the assembly and they put him on trial for basically going against the gods and corrupting the youth. And the jury, made up of thousands of Athenians, they convict him and sentence him to death by drinking poison. And Socrates, even though he is, of course, a philosopher with these great ideas, he respects the government and famously drinks the hemlock, the poison, by his sentence and dies. Kind of a sad end here. The next guy is Plato. Plato's Socrates' most famous student. And when Socrates gets killed for having these ideas, of course, his most famous student flees the city because he's like, well, the writing's on the wall, I'm next. And he flees the city and learns more outside of Athens. But eventually, when he finds out that things have kind of calmed down in Athens and that maybe people are kind of coming around to some of Socrates' ideas, he goes back to Athens. But he's always very, very against democracy. He doesn't trust democracy. He says, really, whatever these mass of people want could end up happening. And he doesn't really trust this mass of people. So instead, he has this idea that he thinks the best form of government would be to have a philosopher, a person who's into learning, be the king, because the smartest person should, in his mind, should really be the one to lead the people. You shouldn't leave leading up to a bunch of people who are not as intelligent. That was Plato's concept. Plato also starts up a school in Athens. We'll talk about that later. Plato had ideas about architecture. He said every object has this ideal form. And one of the examples of that is the Parthenon. Parthenon's probably the most famous building, most famous piece of architecture in ancient Greece. And you can see it's famous because it's been copied. It's been copied over and over again in all kinds of buildings. Even in Milwaukee, if you look at sort of like the courthouse, it has the same structure as the Parthenon. A lot of people like to say the White House in Washington, D.C., of course, has a structure that looks kind of like that. A lot of the other monuments in Washington, D.C., like the Lincoln Memorial and the Jefferson Memorial, also follow a similar architecture. Even banks and even some houses have these columns that give this perfect idea of architecture and structure and order. And this is something that Plato really championed. Plato's most famous student, who went to his academy, was named Aristotle. And Aristotle also studied governments because, well, Aristotle was a thinker and a philosopher, and that's what philosophers do. They study things. One of the things Aristotle studied was government, and he found good and bad examples of all the different kinds of government, but he kind of liked the idea of a single leader best too. You can see his quote there. "We are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit." A lot of smart things written by Aristotle, because I'll tell you, Aristotle was a writer. He wrote so much. One of his most famous ideas is that you should pursue the golden mean. In other words, Aristotle didn't want you to go too far this way or too far that way. He thought it's always the best choice to kind of get in the middle, find the sweet spot. And he called that the golden mean. He also was not just an expert on government, he was an expert on so many different subjects: science, math, architecture, art, you name it. Aristotle was a leader in that. And in fact, he wrote so much about these different subjects really for about 1,000 to 2,000 years after he died. All the major universities looked at Aristotle's writings as really like the subjects for school. So Aristotle's influence doesn't just end in Greece. It actually continues into Europe and in many other places of high learning for thousands of years. All right, so here's a little rundown of the three famous philosophers in Greece. You've got Socrates, of course, executed for corrupting the city's youth, loved to speak with those questions and learn with questions. Plato flees, and then he sets up this school called the Academy, his idea of that philosopher king, and then Aristotle, the most famous student of Plato. Here is a little bit of a rundown. If you need to go back to this, you can always pause this video and kind of jot a few of these ideas down. These are really good ones for your notes. This kind of gives you a summary of their philosophy, of their ideas. Of course, Socrates, again, wanting people to know what they can know, especially by coming up with the answers yourself, by answering deep thinking questions about yourself. Plato, the idea that the gifted few, these few people really should be the ones to have control. This philosopher king is the best way to rule a place. And then Aristotle, just learning all these different kinds of education and then following that middle path to have your best life. Philosophy was the first great Greek contribution in the Golden Age. Next one we're going to talk about is art. All right, this is kind of a rundown of art forms back in ancient Greece. If you look at the far left, this would be standard ancient Greek art. It actually looks a lot like Egyptian art if you think about it, and a lot like Mesopotamian art. There's not much difference about it. If you look at the forms, especially on the left-hand side, they're very similar, but they're all very rigid. They don't look like they're moving. They don't look like they're alive. But another thing that you might notice as you get further to the right is the forms actually become more realistic. And that was a really big hallmark of Greek art. This is what the Greeks bring to art that really people hadn't brought to art before. First of all, that the idea that you want the form, the physical form of the person to be very realistic. If you think back to your Egyptian art, it wasn't realistic. It was just kind of these pictures. But the Greek art, they really want to show all the different, parts of the body, the muscles, oftentimes naked, but they want to show all these different things to really show the true form of people. However, they did like to kind of push it to the perfect extent. What I mean by that is, if they were doing an artistic sculpture of you, they wouldn't necessarily make your body look the way it looks. They would make it the perfect you. And then the other thing they really throw into it, and you can especially see this more towards the right-hand side of the bottom here, is they started to put art in and make art that showed movement. People weren't just stuck in like a straight up and down position. Instead, you can see on the far right, people's arms and legs are actually make them look like they are moving. And that's a lot of times why a lot of the Greek art, their arms and legs fall off, because they weren't just stuck to their body anymore. Now they're actually pointing and doing things with their hands and feet, which unfortunately made a lot of them fall apart. But this is Greek art. Art is more realistic, it shows movement, and that's really what the Greeks bring to art. Of course, one thing to bear in mind though, they do idealize it. So when you see this Greek art, everybody's going to look like they're the most ripped, chiseled version of a human. That's not because everybody in ancient Greece looked that way. It's just because the art, they always wanted it to be like the perfect body. Another form of Greek art that we've got to talk about is drama. This is an example of a Greek theater, and you can see they went to like stints with Greek theaters. This could rival the stadiums today. And this was one of Greeks' most favorite ways to entertain themselves. Drama was really something that the Greeks contribute probably more than anything else. There are famous playwrights that people actually still perform these plays today. You've got Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. They're all famous for writing tragedies. Tragedies are plays that show human suffering, and they usually end in disaster. Tragedies, the reason why the Greeks wrote these tragedies is because they wanted people to feel strong emotions and then release the emotion. Like that was the goal. Like make people just so intense, so like tied up, so anxious, and then release the anxiety. But not release the anxiety by making you feel happy. A lot of times release the anxiety by making something horrible happen at the end. This was the idea that invented by the Greeks of a Greek tragedy, where Romeo and Juliet is one that you've probably read. That's not written by the Greeks, but Shakespeare was absolutely influenced by the Greek tragic writers, and so was pretty much the entire world. Another kind of writing that also happened was the comedies. And the comedies weren't necessarily laugh out loud kind of funny, but comedies, what they really tried to do is mock people or customs. So basically rip on people in Greece or rip on customs that Greek people do. And this was the purpose of comedies. One of the most famous comic writers of ancient Greece was named Aristophanes. And a lot of his plays still exist and survive and are done today too. Last but not least, the last thing that the ancient Greeks really bring that gives them glory is the study of history. And this one applies to us quite a bit, obviously, in history class. Before the Greeks, when people studied history or wrote about history, it was normally to please a king. So if an Egyptian pharaoh wants to write the history of his reign, it's going to be all the good things, and they're going to be exaggerated to the extent. However, that's not really true, is it? That's not reality. And what the Greeks do is they start to bring this idea that history isn't just trying to make someone happy or trying to make someone look good. History is actually a science, something you need to do in a certain way. The father of history, the guy in the top there, is named Herodotus. And we call him the father of history because he starts this new idea of not just writing down whatever he feels like or whatever his king feels like having him do, but instead he says, as a historian, you have an obligation to collect information directly from the source. Does that sound familiar? Of course it does, because this is the father of the way that we do history today, the modern method of history. If you want to write about something historical, you better be able to find sources or people that were there that you can get that historical information from. So that's exactly what Herodotus does. Without him, we wouldn't have to do DBQs. So you can, we could blame Herodotus here. Anyway, the next guy who kind of takes it to the next level is Thucydides. And Thucydides was a Greek historian who is Athenian. He's from Athens, and he writes during the Peloponnesian War. Now, of course, the Peloponnesian War is Athens against Sparta. And the amazing thing Thucydides does is you would expect him to write on the side of Athens a little bit more. You know, give Athens the better look because he is from Athens. But that's not what Thucydides wanted to do. He instead says, nope, we need to write without bias. So that's Thucydides' big contribution. He says, you've got to take bias out of it. You've got to write even for both sides. You can't take one side or the other side. Instead, you've got to show both sides of the story. And even though this man is from Athens, he writes his history of the Peloponnesian War, showing good things about Athens and bad things, good things about Sparta and bad things. And this is his big contribution to historical study. So the classical Greeks, wow, did they give us some things. Their ideas of philosophy, art, theater, and history, they've lived on. And that is what we need to make sure we have in our notes today and we're ready to go with. there you go. You're going to have a quiz on this. Make sure you take that on campus. All right. Have a good one.